Elijah, the janitor, moves through a world that refuses to see his dignity until a barking dog changes everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun rose slowly over Lakemont Hills, gilding the sharp angles of luxury homes with a golden arrogance. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically across manicured lawns. Imported cars reflected dawn in their polished hoods. But in the quiet hours before the neighborhood truly woke, a man walked the cracked pavement with a quiet dignity no one seemed to notice. Elijah Harris, 52, wore his work uniform like armor. Navy coveralls faded by detergent and time, heavy boots scuffed but upright, and gloves hanging from his back pocket. His frame, still solid, carried the weight of decades spent cleaning messes made by people who never said thank you. His gait was calm, practiced. You'd think he was invisible if not for the clipboard he carried and the way he checked off each task with deliberate precision. The Crawford estate was one of the grandest on Oakshade Drive, a colonial revival mansion with a 5-car garage and a wraparound porch that looked like it had never heard the word no. Inside lived Preston Crawford, a tech magnate with a politician's smirk, his icy wife Judith, and their 24-year-old son Bradley, blonde, broad-shouldered, and endlessly entitled. They didn't own the neighborhood, but they acted like it. Elijah arrived every morning before sunrise, long before the Crawfords woke. That was by design. He was contracted through a service, but they'd personally requested him, not because he was exceptional, though he was, but because he never made them uncomfortable. He kept his head down. He didn't talk unless spoken to, and when spoken to, he answered with yes sir and no ma'am, the way they liked it. He washed their cars, cleaned their gutters, hauled their trash. When the neighbors had parties, Elijah stayed late to clear champagne flutes and sweep up glitter that clung to the lawn like lies. No one tipped him. No one remembered his birthday. No one asked where he went when he wasn't serving them. Yet Elijah bore it all with a calm grace. Not out of weakness, but something deeper. A slow-burning patience that came from knowing he was playing the long game. Still, that patience was tested every single day in ways small and cruel. "Don't use the front hose," Judith once warned, her voice flat as porcelain. "It's decorative." Bradley had once tossed him a rag like a dog toy and barked, "You missed a spot, dude. Try again." The dude burned more than the command. But Elijah nodded, wiped the fender, and kept his voice steady. That morning, he was pruning hedges when the bark cut through the quiet. A sharp, repeated yap. It came from the porch. He turned slowly, shears in hand. Max, the Crawfords' French bulldog, had gotten loose again. The little beast had been spoiled into defiance, snapping at ankles, climbing on furniture, and leaving steaming gifts on stone tiles like it owned the place. Max stood now, tail curled, eyes locked on Elijah. A pile of fresh dog poop sat beside him, steaming in the early light, right at the top of the marble steps. Elijah exhaled softly through his nose and walked toward the porch. The front door slammed open. Bradley Crawford stepped out shirtless, coffee mug in hand, sunglasses pushed up on his head. His gaze swept the porch, then settled on Elijah with casual disdain. "Elijah," he called, his voice full of privilege and amusement. "We've got a situation up here." Elijah stopped at the base of the steps, eyes flicking from the dog to the mess to Bradley. "You see this?" Bradley pointed with his mug, not bothering to step closer. "Max had an accident. Right on the marble. My dad's gonna flip." Elijah nodded once. "I'll get the cleaning kit." But Bradley raised his voice, grinning now. "No, man. Just use your hands. Get it done quick. I've got people coming over in 20. Elijah froze. The words landed like a slap, but not a new one. The kind that bruises where no one can see. Bradley was testing him, no, taunting him, in the most humiliating way possible, and he knew exactly what he was doing. A silence fell over the porch. Max barked again. Once. Elijah looked up at Bradley, the young man's grin stretching wider as if daring him to protest. Elijah said nothing. He took off his gloves slowly, placed them on the steps, and reached for a paper towel from the side pouch of his kit. His movements were deliberate, slow, not obedience, calculation. Bradley laughed, stepping back into the house. "That's what I'm talking about. You're a real one, Elijah. Real MVP." The door shut. Elijah stood alone with the dog. He cleaned the mess, but his eyes weren't on the tiles. They were on the door that had closed behind Bradley, and something behind those eyes shifted. Later, after he'd disposed of the waste and washed his hands in the side spigot, not the decorative one, Elijah returned to the tool shed. It was quiet. He opened the small locker where he kept his lunch and tools. And there, tucked between a thermos and a coil of extension cord, was an envelope. Yellowed, thick, addressed to Elijah M. Harris, in ink faded but unmistakable. He stared at it for a long moment, then reached in and pulled it out. Inside, wrapped in folded parchment and lined with trembling script, was something he hadn't touched in years. A deed. Stamped, signed, and still legally active. He looked at the date. 1948. He looked at the property description. Crawford Estate. And just as the weight of it began to settle into his bones, he heard the door creak open behind him. "Elijah," Bradley's voice again, but sharper now, impatient. "I need you out front. There's something else you missed." Elijah turned slowly, the envelope still in his hand, fingers tightening around it like a lifeline. This time he didn't answer with "yes, sir." He didn't answer at all. Bradley's voice echoed again, louder, demanding, and Elijah stepped out of the shed, envelope in hand, walking toward him for the first time with a different look in his eyes. What drives a man to clean floors for the people who once stole his family's home? The gravel crunched beneath Elijah's boots as he stepped out from the tool shed. The envelope was still in his hand, its edges softened with age but the weight of its meaning sharp in his grip. Bradley stood at the end of the walkway, his arms crossed, phone in hand, scrolling with that impatient detachment reserved for people who'd never been told no. "You deaf now?" Bradley barked, looking up. "I said the trash cans weren't lined, again." Elijah didn't flinch. He tucked the envelope inside his coveralls, close to his chest. "I'll handle it," he said, voice low. "Damn right you will." Bradley turned and walked back inside, leaving the front door wide open like he didn't even see Elijah standing there. That was always the trick of racism in Lakemont Hills. It never shouted. Not anymore. It whispered through gate buzzers that took too long to answer when Elijah spoke, through the way Judith clutched her purse even though she'd known him for 6 years, through the way the Crawfords always paused a second too long before calling him by name, as if tasting it in their mouths like something foreign. As Elijah pulled the trash bins from the side of the house, his mind wasn't on liners or schedules. It was back in 1964, in a hot Alabama field, where his grandfather, Elijah Sr., had stood in front of a clapboard house with calloused hands and a letter that promised ownership. He could still hear the older man's voice in memory. Slow, deep, tired. "This land's ours now, Eli. No matter what they say, paper says so." Elijah had been 6 when his grandfather first showed him that deed. He remembered the pride in the old man's voice, the way he smoothed the document on the dining table like it was the Bible. The family had worked 3 generations to buy that land, 20 acres of fertile soil with a modest home. It had taken every saved dollar and a miracle. And then it was gone. They said it was back taxes, a clerical error. The county had auctioned it off without notifying Elijah Sr. The buyers were white, well-connected, unapologetic. They built a mansion on the ruins. Elijah had never been back until he took the janitor job there, years later, without telling anyone why. He hadn't even told his own children. Not that he saw them much anymore. "Man like me doesn't get the luxury of outrage," he once said to a coworker who'd asked why he still scrubbed toilets at 60. "I get silence and slow moves. That's how we survive." But even slow moves eventually lead somewhere. As he finished tying the bags and wheeling the bins to the curb, his phone buzzed, a rare occurrence. He wiped his hands and pulled it from his pocket. One text, a number he hadn't seen in years. "Alex, you still have the papers?" Alex was his cousin, a paralegal in Atlanta now, after clawing out of poverty through night school and ramen noodles. Elijah had mailed him a copy of the deed 5 years ago, more out of nostalgia than hope. Alex had replied once, vaguely encouraging, then nothing. Elijah stared at the message, his heart hammering. He looked up, just as Mrs. Crawford's SUV pulled into the drive. Judith stepped out, dressed in all-white crisp blouse, cream slacks, gold sandals. Her sunglasses were oversized and impersonal. She barely acknowledged Elijah's presence except for a flick of the eye. "Could you be a dear and hose down the driveway?" she said. "Max had a bit of an accident earlier, again." Elijah nodded. She paused. "Oh, and use the back hose. The front one's still decorative." He said nothing. She walked past him as though walking past a statue. Elijah moved to the backyard, his mind a storm. He thought of his grandfather, of Alex's text, of the letter tucked into his shirt. He turned on the hose, water gushing like a floodgate, and began washing the driveway. But what he really wanted to do was wash the entire lie away, the stolen land, the fake charm, the daily slights no one called slurs but hurt just the same. As he sprayed the last of the suds from the curb, a faint voice called from the hedges. "Elijah." He turned, startled. It was the Crawfords' youngest daughter, Macy, 12, small, awkward, more curious than cruel. "What's up, Miss Macy?" he asked, wiping his hands. She tilted her head. "Why do you work here?" The question hit him harder than any insult, not because it was rude, but because it was honest. He smiled gently. "Someone's got to keep things clean." She frowned. "But they're mean to you, I hear them." Elijah hesitated. Sometimes folks don't know how to be kind, or don't want to. "Do you like them?" He paused, crouched down and looked at her level. "No, but that doesn't mean I hate them. It just means I see what they don't." "What don't they see?" He straightened. "Me." Macy looked confused, then nodded like she was pretending to understand. "You should tell them," she said, skipping off toward the pool, "that you're somebody." Elijah stared after her, heart aching.
Maybe he would.
Maybe it was time. Back inside the shed, he pulled out the envelope again and studied the signature on the deed. Elijah Sr. The same looping cursive. The county stamp. The plat number. It was all there. It had always been there. He reached for his phone again and typed a reply. "Elijah, I still have them. Want to meet?" He hit send. As he sat down on the edge of the workbench, his chest heavy, he remembered the night his grandfather died. His last words were strange, urgent. "They think it's theirs because they paved it. But dirt don't forget who it fed." A knock startled him. Not a tap, a firm, deliberate knock on the shed's side door. No one ever used that door. He stood slowly, walking over, heart racing. He opened it. And there, standing in slacks and a gray blazer, holding a thin black briefcase, was a tall black man in his 30s. "Elijah Harris?" the man asked. "Yes. I'm Malik Thompson, civil rights law firm. Your cousin Alex sent me." Elijah blinked. "I believe," Malik said, stepping forward, "you're the legal owner of this estate, and we're going to prove it." Elijah stared at the lawyer in stunned silence, heart pounding. The world he'd kept buried was suddenly standing on his doorstep, briefcase in hand. The poop on the porch wasn't just waste. It was a symbol of what they thought Elijah was worth. The sun had fully broken through the clouds now, washing the Crawford estate in light that felt almost accusatory. The marble porch shimmered, pristine aside from one jarring blemish, a heap of dog feces, centered like a mocking centerpiece. Elijah stood a few feet away, staring down at it, the gloved hand at his side trembling just enough for him to feel it. He'd faced worse in life, far worse, but something about this moment, the laughter echoing from inside, the stifled chuckles of Bradley's guests, the casualness with which he was being degraded, cracked open a nerve long buried beneath years of obedience. Inside the house, voices rose. The Crawfords were hosting a brunch, a networking event for local elites, all white, all wealthy, all equally disinterested in the man outside serving as their entertainment. Through the tall windows, Elijah could see a dozen people dressed in linen and pastels, sipping mimosas and peering toward the porch with curiosity. Then Bradley stepped out again, holding a champagne flute. Behind him, a man in a salmon blazer said, "Is he really about to do it? Man, you weren't kidding. This is wild." Bradley grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. "Elijah, my guy. Front and center. Handle the situation, please." Elijah bent down, slowly, his knees cracking as he lowered himself to the marble. His mind screamed, but his face remained composed. He reached for a wad of paper towels, pulling them from his side pouch. His hand hesitated midair. One of the women inside whispered, "This is so uncomfortable," but no one moved to stop it. Elijah's hand finally touched the mess, wrapping it gently in layers of tissue. He didn't gag, didn't flinch, didn't even look up. That would have given them something. And Elijah Harris never gave more than he had to. As he stood and began wiping the last traces from the tile, Bradley chuckled. "You've got a real talent for this, man. Seriously. You should open your own janitor company or something." Someone clapped sarcastically. "Think he does birthday parties?" Another guest joked. Elijah moved to the edge of the porch, disposing of the waste in a small bin. Every movement was measured, intentional. Inside he was unraveling, but outside he was a sculpture. Firm, unmoving, unreadable. The porch quieted momentarily when Judith appeared at the door. She glanced at the scene with mild distaste, not because of the cruelty, but because of the mess. "Elijah, when you're done there, please pressure wash the porch. We have guests." "Yes, ma'am," he said. But then came the twist, the one none of them expected. "Elijah, real quick," Bradley said, still smiling, but now holding his phone in selfie mode. "We're doing a story series, Unsung Heroes of Lakemont Hills. Gotta get you in one. Hold the trash bag up. Say something inspirational. Elijah froze. This wasn't just mockery anymore. It was performance. It was turning his pain into a punchline, and they all watched like it was a reality show. He turned slowly, the bag still in one hand. Bradley's phone was pointed at him, the lens capturing his posture, his silence, his uniform. I said smile, man. Come on, it's a good angle. Your grandkids'll love it one day. And then quietly, Elijah spoke. Not to Bradley, not to the crowd. To himself. My grandfather planted sugarcane with these hands, he said. Built a home with these hands. Got it taken from him, but not like this. Bradley laughed. What? Elijah looked him in the eyes for the first time. There was no hate there, just clarity. Put the phone away, Elijah said. Bradley blinked, surprised. Excuse me? You heard me. That's enough. The room fell silent. No one had ever heard Elijah speak like that. Not even Judith. Not even the other staff. It wasn't the volume. It was the finality in his voice. The authority. Elijah, Judith snapped. This is inappropriate. But Elijah wasn't listening. His gloved hand slowly reached into his coveralls, pulling out the envelope. He didn't hold it up. He didn't wave it. He simply looked down at it for a long moment, then slid it into his back pocket like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. What's that? Bradley asked, suspicious now. Elijah didn't answer. The moment passed without fireworks, no shouting, no confrontation. But something had undeniably shifted in the air. Elijah walked off the porch, tools in hand, heading toward the shed with the slow stride of a man who wasn't running from anything anymore, but toward something he'd waited his entire life to reclaim. Inside, the guests exchanged awkward glances. Judith pursed her lips. Bradley frowned. Was that a threat? He muttered, looking at his father. Preston Crawford, who had been mostly absent that morning, now stepped into view. He hadn't spoken to Elijah in over a year, not directly. But he watched him now, through the window, with the expression of a man who suddenly noticed the quiet man he'd ignored for too long. I don't know, Preston said quietly, but something's off. Back at the shed, Elijah shut the door behind him and opened the envelope again. He spread the deed out on the workbench, smoothing its creases. His fingers trembled, but not with fear. With memory. With anger. And for the first time in a long time, with power. He picked up his phone and dialed Alex. Voicemail. He left a message. Tell your friend the lawyer to come back. We're going forward. They want to play games, fine. But I've got the real story, and I've got the paper to prove it. He hung up. Then suddenly he heard something strange. A knock at the shed door. Soft. Rhythmic, but not a hand. A cane. He opened it slowly. An elderly white man stood there, dressed in a suit too old for the heat, holding a wooden cane carved with initials. E.H. Elijah Harris? The man asked. Yes? I think your grandfather might have saved my life. I need to talk to you. It's about the land. Elijah's grip tightened on the doorframe as the man continued. I was there in '48 when they took it from him. I have something he gave me before he died, and I think you'll want to see it. Behind every mansion is a graveyard of stolen dreams, and Elijah's family is buried deep. The old man's name was Sam Whitmore. His voice trembled not from weakness but from the weight of memory. He sat in the corner of Elijah's tool shed on a folding chair. Elijah dusted off, hands resting on the curved head of his cane, eyes distant but sharp. I shouldn't have waited this long, Sam said, looking around the modest room like it was a cathedral. But I didn't know you were still here. I thought your family left Georgia after what happened. Elijah's jaw tensed. He poured a glass of water, handed it to the man, and leaned against the workbench where the deed lay open like a wound. What happened, Mr. Whitmore? Elijah asked quietly. Start at the part where my grandfather lost everything. Sam took a slow sip, then nodded. I was a clerk in the county recorder's office. Just a kid then, 22 maybe. We weren't allowed to speak up, but we saw everything. Your grandfather, Elijah Sr., he came in with the deed, paid off every cent they claimed he owed in back taxes. I stamped the payment receipt myself. Elijah's heart pounded louder with every word. But then, Sam continued, the sheriff came in the next week. He brought a new document, said the payment was late, that the land had already been foreclosed on. That's a lie, Elijah said, voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded. It was. The date on the foreclosure was forged. Everyone in the office knew it. But the Crawfords were powerful. Preston's father, Henry, was friends with the county commissioner. That land was sold at auction before your grandfather even knew it was gone. Elijah closed his eyes, He could see his grandfather in that moment, standing in front of a desk, fists clenched, trying to hold on to the only thing his family had ever owned. "They dragged him out," Sam said, voice cracking, like a trespasser. "Called him a squatter on his own land. I saw it happen." Elijah opened his eyes again, glassy but fierce. "And you did nothing." "I was a coward," Sam whispered, "but I kept this." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Yellowed, frayed, the ink faded but still legible. He handed it to Elijah. It was a will. Not just any will, but the original, signed and notarized, dated a year before the foreclosure. In it, Elijah Sr. left the land and home to his son Marcus, Elijah's father, and to his grandson Elijah, who was named specifically. Elijah traced the signature with trembling fingers. "They made sure this never made it into court," Sam said. "Told me if I ever spoke up I'd lose everything. But I'm old now, and sick, and tired of carrying this lie." Elijah sat down, chest heaving. A broken promise preserved for decades in a drawer by a man who could have saved them. And yet, here it was, somehow, still alive. His family had lived in rented apartments all over Georgia after losing the land. His father never got over it. He drank himself into silence by the time Elijah was in high school. He'd always said, "They didn't just take our house, they took our place in this world." Sam stood to leave, but turned back. "There's a name on the back of that envelope," he said. "I wrote it there in '69. Man named Malik Thompson. He works for the Atlanta Civil Rights Legal Fund. If anyone can help you, it's him." Elijah stared at the back of the envelope. There it was, scrawled in fountain pen ink, M. Thompson, ACLF. Why him? His father was one of the only lawyers who ever challenged the Crawfords, Sam said. Didn't win. But he came close. Malik's smarter, meaner, and hungry for justice. Sam paused, eyes misting. "Tell him Sam Whitmore sent you. Maybe that'll count for something." He turned and left. Elijah sat for a long time in silence. Around him, the dull hum of sprinklers, birdsong, and distant laughter from the house he was about to wage war on. Every brick of that estate rested on a lie, and now he held the truth in both hands. He picked up his phone and dialed the number Alex had sent earlier. A calm voice answered. Malik Thompson. Elijah hesitated. Then, "This is Elijah Harris. I think we need to talk. It's about some land in Lakemont Hills, and a will no one wanted found." Malik didn't respond right away. "Then I've been waiting for this call." Malik's voice grew sharper. "Meet me tomorrow morning, and bring everything. If what you're saying is true, Elijah, you don't just work for the Crawfords, you own them." He was told to clean the trash, but the real garbage was buried in the history of the house. Elijah rose early the next morning, long before the neighborhood had shed its silence. The air still held the scent of dew and cut grass, and the sky was a pale smear of blue over Lakemont Hills. He walked the familiar route toward the Crawford estate with a satchel slung across his shoulder, heavier than usual, not from tools but from the weight of what it carried. The deed, the will, the names, history, pain, proof. With each step, his boots pressed into the sidewalk like punctuation marks in a sentence he'd waited a lifetime to finish. The estate loomed ahead like it always had, elegant, imposing, blindingly white. A facade built not just on wealth but on erasure. The irony hit Elijah differently now. For years they had called him the janitor, the help, the cleanup man. But all this time, he had been sweeping not just their mess, but the remnants of his family's stolen legacy. And now he knew the truth. The mansion stood not as a symbol of success, but as a monument to theft. He clocked in as usual, unnoticed. Judith was already gone to yoga, Preston was buried in the upstairs study, and Bradley, as always, was sleeping off whatever sins he'd committed the night before. Elijah moved through the house with quiet efficiency, gathering trash, clearing dishes left half-eaten on counters, collecting empty wine bottles that stank of entitlement. Every discarded item was another reminder. They lived carelessly, blindly, never questioning the comfort that surrounded them. Why would they? Their comfort came at someone else's cost, and Elijah had paid it, day by day, piece by piece. In the kitchen, he opened the trash drawer and paused. Inside was a crumpled napkin with the word Janitor scribbled in Sharpie. Someone had drawn a stick figure with a mop, surrounded by stink lines. It was childish, pointless, but the impact was razor sharp. Elijah stood there for a long moment, the napkin pinched between his fingers. He felt a strange mix of rage and exhaustion swirl inside him, the way a man might feel standing over a grave that never should have existed. He shoved the napkin in his pocket and moved on. By midday, he descended into the basement, his least favorite place. It was cold, dark, and musty with neglect. No one ever came down here but him. That suited the Crawfords fine. Down here, he wasn't a person. He was a shadow doing what shadows do: cleaning, fixing, disappearing. He set the trash bins by the old furnace and sat on a metal stool. For a moment, he just breathed. Then his face collapsed into his hands. He didn't cry often, not because he was too proud, but because life had taught him that tears rarely solved anything. But here, beneath the house built on his family's bones, he let it come. It wasn't just the memory of his grandfather's land being stolen. It was the realization that he had lived for decades trying not to make white people uncomfortable. That he had shrunk himself, bent himself, softened his own existence just to survive in spaces that were stolen from him in the first place. The silence down there was loud. It was the kind that wraps around your chest and dares you to breathe. Elijah wiped his face, stood up, and looked around. Then something caught his eye. A narrow shelf tucked behind a rusted water heater, covered in dust and cobwebs, nearly invisible. He pulled the old wooden crate from behind it. Inside, yellowed papers, tax receipts, newspaper clippings. A faded family photo. His family, in front of a home that no longer stood. Then at the bottom, folded inside plastic wrap, was a document. A deed. Not the one from Sam Whitmore. This was older, official, crisp in places where the ink had thickened. It bore his grandfather's name, Elijah M. Harris, Sr. And in bold print, beneath the county seal, it read, "Rightful owner, parcel 4413, deed of property, transfer voids without consent." Elijah's knees nearly gave. He sank to the floor and opened the plastic, heart thudding. This document had never been voided, never signed away. It still held legal weight, still held life. It had been hidden here, buried like a dirty secret, forgotten by the very people who had benefited from pretending it didn't exist. He scanned the bottom. There was a small note, handwritten, barely legible. "Keep this safe. They'll bury me before they bury this truth. E.H. Signer." The room spun around him. It was as if the air itself had changed, thick with revelation. He held the paper to his chest and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His phone buzzed. It was Malik. Elijah answered with trembling fingers. "Mr. Harris," Malik said, his tone sharp and direct. "Change of plans. Meet me in 2 days. There's been a development." Elijah wiped the sweat from his brow. "What kind of development?" "We filed a public inquiry into the property history. Got a hit from a former clerk who worked the foreclosure records in the 60s. Turns out someone tried to scrub the documents." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "The Crawfords?" "Too early to say, but someone went to a lot of trouble to make your grandfather's deed disappear. If what you told me is true, and if what we just found matches your documents, this case could go way beyond a simple land dispute." Elijah looked down at the newly discovered deed in his hands. "I found it," he whispered. "The original. It was hidden here, in their house. My house." Malik was silent for a beat. "Then bring everything. We're going to blow this wide open." Elijah nodded, his grip tightening on the document. 2 days, Malik added. "And Elijah, be careful. People don't like losing power, especially when it was never really theirs." Elijah ended the call and sat still for a long moment. Upstairs, the Crawfords laughed over lunch. A world above his head, oblivious to the earthquake forming below their feet. As Elijah tucked the deed into his satchel, the door to the basement creaked open and a voice called down from the top of the stairs. "Elijah? What are you doing down there?" It was Preston Crawford. Some homes are haunted not by spirits but by stolen signatures and silent screams. Elijah stood still, the dampness of the basement walls breathing around him like an old sigh. The newly discovered deed pressed flat against his chest. Preston's voice echoed down the stairs again, casual, like this was any other day. "You good down there, Elijah?" He hid the document beneath a folded drop cloth, composed his face, and responded without turning around. "Just finishing up, Mr. Crawford." There was a pause, then a dismissive, "All right, don't forget to lock up the side shed when you're done." The door creaked shut again. Elijah exhaled slowly. He counted 3 full breaths before moving. The tension didn't drain from him, it just slid lower into his bones. He packed the deed, the will, and every document Sam Whitmore had given him into a battered folder, wrapped it in a plastic bag, and tucked it deep into his satchel. That night he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wind sounded like history trying to speak. At dawn he boarded a bus to Atlanta and arrived at a narrow brick building downtown, marked modestly with a bronze plaque, Atlanta Civil Rights Legal Fund. Inside, Malik Thompson waited, younger than Elijah had expected, late 30s, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes that didn't blink much. His office was cluttered but methodical, case files stacked like small towers, books open mid-thought, legal pads covered in handwriting. Elijah laid out the documents on the desk. Malik flipped through them with the careful precision of a man trained to find buried truths in black ink. "Your grandfather's deed," he said, running a finger along the seal. "Unbroken chain of title. Never officially voided. The foreclosure was falsified, just like Sam said." Elijah nodded, fingers gripping the armrest of the chair. "This right here," Malik continued, tapping the signature, "is the key. Georgia's heir property laws, especially post-1983 reforms, state that if a property deed was never legally transferred or voided, and a will exists naming heirs, the descendants can pursue a claim of restoration. That means, it's still ours," Elijah interrupted, his voice low. Malik leaned back, tapping a pen against his leg. "It means you've got a case, a damn good one, but that doesn't mean it'll be easy." "I've been cleaning my own floors," Elijah said quietly, "in a house built on my grandfather's grave. I'm not looking for easy." Malik nodded slowly. "Then you'll want to understand the game they've been playing." He walked to a whiteboard behind his desk, uncapped a marker, and drew a map of Georgia counties. From 1870 to the 1980s, thousands of black families lost land through loopholes. Heirs who didn't know to file claims, back taxes applied selectively, zoning changes without notice. In some cases, courthouses lost the deeds. In others, the banks colluded with county clerks. And in a few, like yours, powerful white families orchestrated the theft from behind closed doors. "They knew what they were doing," Elijah said, voice taut with grief and fury. "They always did," Malik agreed, "but they counted on one thing, that nobody would go looking." Malik picked up a folder from his desk. "We already ran preliminary checks against the county archive. There's a missing microfilm entry for the week your grandfather supposedly defaulted. That's not an accident. Someone erased it." Elijah felt something cold coil in his gut. "That's illegal, right?" "Absolutely. But hard to prove unless we find the backup records. The city stores them separately under a preservation clause. It's rare but not impossible." Malik opened his laptop, eyes scanning as he typed. "If we can cross-reference the city's master register from that year with the deed you found, we can file an injunction. That means stopping the Crawfords from selling, renovating, or refinancing the house until the court decides ownership." "You're saying I could get it back?" "I'm saying," Malik replied, eyes meeting Elijah's, "we could make them answer for every lie they've built their lives on." The weight of it hit Elijah in waves, not just the idea of reclaiming a house, but reclaiming history. He pictured his grandfather's rough hands holding that first deed, the pride in his eyes, the betrayal that followed. He thought of his father's quiet rage, the way he stopped talking about the land, like saying its name hurt too much. "Elijah," Malik said carefully, "I need to tell you something else." Elijah looked up. "There's a clause in the city's record archive, buried in old policy language. It was written in 1945, a preservation clause for disputed properties. If we find that clause was violated during the foreclosure process, and it's still on record, it overrides the auction entirely." Elijah blinked. "What does that mean?" Malik leaned in, voice lowering. "It means not only was the foreclosure illegal, but any development, construction, or sale on that land, including the Crawfords' mansion, could be considered invalid. That would give us the grounds to file for full restitution. Not just land, not just the house, damages, reparations." Elijah gripped the arms of his chair, heart pounding. "But there's a problem," Malik continued. "Those records aren't digital. They're in a physical ledger, stored at the city planning department. And no one's touched that archive in over 20 years. "And if the Crawfords found out we're looking?" Elijah asked. Malik paused. "They'll try to block access, maybe destroy what's left." Elijah stood. "Then we better move fast." Malik nodded and handed him a fresh copy of the deed, scanned and notarized. "Keep this with you at all times. And Elijah, if anyone questions you, anyone at all, don't answer, call me." Elijah tucked the folder under his arm. As he reached the door, Malik added, "We go to the planning office tomorrow morning. I'll meet you there at 9 sharp." Elijah opened the door, sunlight flooding in. But the light didn't feel warm. It felt like a spotlight, like eyes were suddenly watching from every corner. Just as Elijah stepped outside, his phone buzzed with a new message. No name, just a number. "You're making a mistake. Walk away before you lose everything." Every room in the mansion whispers stories, but none louder than Elijah's truth. Elijah returned to the Crawford estate the next morning like he had for nearly a decade. But everything looked different now. Not physically. The white columns still loomed like ivory towers. The windows shimmered with expensive glass. The American flag fluttered obediently in the manicured breeze. But something inside him had shifted permanently. The house no longer stood as a symbol of power. It was evidence. A crime scene. A monument built on the bones of his ancestors. and he walked through it not as a servant, but as a man reclaiming something stolen, piece by piece, memory by memory. He moved silently, mop in hand, passing through rooms that once made him feel small. Now he let his eyes linger on the details, the crown molding his grandfather had paid to install, the oak banister that matched the style in their old farmhouse, the backyard fountain built on the precise spot where Elijah Sr.'s chicken coop once stood. The walls were white, yes, but beneath the paint was black labor, black blood, and black silence. Elijah felt it in every floorboard. This house wasn't just built on stolen land. It was haunted by everything they had tried to erase. By mid-morning, the Crawfords had all left for various appointments. Judith to her cosmetic surgeon, Preston to a breakfast with donors, and Bradley, likely to wherever entitled men went to drink off the night before. Elijah took the moment of solitude and entered the study. He rarely stepped foot in that room. It was where Preston kept locked drawers and legal binders filled with business deals, political donations, and files labeled confidential. But today Elijah's hands didn't hesitate. He moved to the far shelf, where he'd once seen a dusty ledger marked historic property and tax adjustments. He pulled it out and flipped through the pages with quiet desperation, scanning for anything familiar. He found it in the margins of a 1970 entry, Parcel 4413, redeveloped. Special permit approved by city vote. His heart skipped. That was the same year his family was officially removed from the land roll. Elijah kept reading, finding the names of 2 city council members listed beside the authorization. He paused. Councilman Randall Mace, Councilwoman Delia Rowe. Elijah remembered hearing those names from his father, always said with a bitterness that coated his voice like ash. They were the ones who had smiled at church but voted behind closed doors to bulldoze black neighborhoods. Elijah pulled out his phone and took photos of every page with their signatures. But just as he turned to grab one more folder, a thick binder labeled Historic Zoning Appeals, the sound of a key in the front door made his blood chill. He froze, listening. Footsteps. Loud, sloppy, familiar. "Yo, I left my charger." Bradley's voice boomed through the hall. "Dad, you home?" Elijah crouched behind the desk, heart pounding in his ears. The binder was half open on the floor. He snapped one last photo, closed it, and began to slide it back into place when, "What the hell are you doing?" Bradley stood in the doorway, hoodie halfway on, expression shifting from confusion to accusation in seconds. Elijah stood slowly, still holding the phone. "I was cleaning," he said, calm but alert. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "With your phone out?" Elijah didn't answer. Bradley stepped into the room. "You were taking pictures. What, trying to sue us? Think you're going to be the next Netflix documentary?" Elijah held his ground. "This house holds more than you know." "Oh, I know," Bradley snapped. "I know my dad worked his ass off for this. I know you're lucky to even breathe the same air we do. And I know," he stepped closer, eyes narrowing, "you're not stupid enough to think you belong in this room." Elijah didn't flinch. "No, I don't belong here." Bradley smirked. "Exactly. I belong upstairs," Elijah interrupted softly. "By right." Bradley's face twisted. "What?" But Elijah didn't answer. He calmly walked past him, phone still in hand, and stepped into the hallway. Bradley didn't stop him. Not yet. Outside, Elijah walked to the shed and locked the door behind him. He pulled out his notebook, jotted down the names, the file numbers, the dates. Then he called Malik. "I have something," he said. "Names, votes, council minutes from 1970. They were tied to the redevelopment." Malik was silent for a moment. Then that could be the missing link. Elijah nodded. "They hid it in plain sight. I'll start digging into city archives. If we prove collusion, we're not just talking ownership. We're talking civil rights violations. Land theft with intent. That's federal." Elijah's hand trembled, but he steadied it. Then Malik's voice lowered. "Elijah, I also found something else. Something about your father." Elijah froze. "My father?" He filed a formal complaint in 1973, claimed political targeting, racial intimidation. It was dismissed, but the complaint was archived with the city clerk's records. "We're requesting it now." Elijah's chest tightened. His father had tried. All those years of silence weren't surrender. They were scars from a battle no one saw. Back in the mansion, Bradley paced the study, red-faced, pulling out drawers, scanning the bookshelves. "Dad needs to know about this," he muttered. "He needs to know what that old man's doing." Then he paused, eyes falling on something tucked behind the globe stand, a thin red notebook with the initials EH etched in the corner. He pulled it out, flipping through the pages. His smirk returned. As Elijah headed home, unaware, Bradley snapped a photo of the notebook and sent it in a text to Preston Crawford with one sentence. I think our janitor's about to make us very poor. When a black man walks in with truth, even gold-plated lies begin to tarnish. The next morning, Malik's office buzzed with the kind of quiet fury reserved for war rooms. The walls bore maps of land parcels, pins marking disputed properties, and a large dry erase board that now read in bold red marker, Harris for Crawford. Elijah sat across from Malik at the long table, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable as his lawyer explained the next steps. We're filing an injunction this week. Our goal is to freeze all activity on the property. That includes the trust that funds the estate. If we stop their ability to move money, they'll have no choice but to respond. Elijah nodded, and the deed, authenticated. The city records department backed it. Your grandfather never lost legal claim. The will cements the bloodline. Combined with the fraud in the foreclosure, we're looking at a legitimate case of racial land theft. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Then we push. Malik slid a folder across the table. Inside was a draft of the lawsuit, formal and damning. The opening line simple but heavy. This action is brought forth in the name of Elijah M. Harris II, rightful heir to parcel 4433, against the unlawful occupants and beneficiaries of said property. But it was the last page Elijah lingered on. A personal statement written in his own hand, trembling but true. In it, he didn't just speak about the land. He spoke about years of humiliation, of watching his family shrink in the face of injustice, of the indignity of being called the help on ground soaked in his grandfather's sweat. Later that night, he sat at the small kitchen table of his modest home and wrote a letter to the Crawfords. Not an angry letter, a declaration. To the Crawfords, I have served your home with dignity, though it was never given in return. I have seen my family's legacy repurposed for your comfort. What was taken in silence will now be reclaimed in truth. Elijah M. Harris. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and hand-delivered it the next morning. No drama, just placed it on their porch beneath the brass knocker he once polished every Thursday. That evening, while sitting on his back porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Malik again. They've seen the suit. Their lawyers called this morning. And they're mocking us, claimed you're just a bitter old man looking for a payout, said your documents wouldn't stand under scrutiny. Elijah smiled bitterly. They're scared. Malak's voice sharpened. We hit a nerve, but listen, this isn't just about you anymore. The press is picking it up, we're getting calls. Elijah's chest tightened. Media.
OTL News. A reporter named Sophia Grant. She's digging into the city council corruption angle. She'll probably reach out to you directly.
Elijah looked out at the dark street beyond his fence. The same neighborhood that had ignored him for years now felt alive, watching, waiting. And behind closed doors, the Crawfords weren't laughing as freely. Judith had read Elijah's letter aloud during dinner, waving it like a child's drawing. I mean, really, she scoffed. Does he expect to walk in here with dusty old papers and suddenly become our landlord? Preston didn't respond. His fork moved mechanically through his food. Bradley, meanwhile, was scrolling through online news. There's a blog about it already, he muttered. Some civil rights watchdog site says we might have been part of a racially rigged land seizure. Judith scoffed. Bloggers, they'll write anything. But then Mrs. Crawford, Judith's mother, mostly silent throughout the evening, spoke up for the first time in years. His grandfather's name was Elijah too, she said softly. He used to bring us eggs when we lived in the Valley House. He was kind. Everyone turned to her. You knew him? Preston asked. She nodded slowly, eyes misty. He wore suspenders and carried a handkerchief in his pocket. Your father always said he was too proud for a colored man, but I remember he gave me a pocket angel carved from wood, said it was for protection. She looked at Judith. He wasn't bitter, just tired. Bradley looked back at his phone. Doesn't matter. He's coming for what's not his. Mrs. Crawford said nothing, but her silence was heavier now, and deep inside her, something shifted, the memory of a gentle man with strong hands and tired eyes returning to life. The next afternoon, Elijah was working on his back porch, sorting through another box of old tax documents, when he heard a knock at the front door. He stood slowly, walked through the small living room, and opened it. A woman stood there, holding a microphone in one hand, a camera crew behind her. Mr. Harris? She asked, professional but warm. He nodded. I'm Sophia Grant with OTL News. May I have a few moments of your time? As Elijah hesitated, unsure whether to speak, Sophia gently raised the mic and asked, Is it true you're the rightful owner of the Crawford estate, and that it was stolen from your family by the city? The video of Elijah scrubbing poop goes viral, but this time, the world is watching. The clip was only 12 seconds long. Shaky phone footage captured Elijah, crouched on the Crawford's porch, scrubbing a smear of dog feces with paper towels. In the background, Bradley's voice could be heard, dripping with entitlement. Use your hands, man. Do it quick. I've got people coming over. Laughter followed. No one said his name. No one defended him. He was just the janitor. Sophia Grant's investigative piece had gone live the night before. In it, Elijah spoke softly but firmly about his family's land, the forged foreclosure, the rediscovered deed. Then came the footage, not shown as spectacle, but as context. Proof. The story wasn't just about a legal battle. It was about humiliation disguised as employment, power masquerading as politeness, and racism that didn't need slurs to cause harm. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire. Twitter, TikTok, news syndicates, civil rights forums, Instagram influencers reposted the clip with captions like, "Imagine scrubbing floors on land your grandfather built." From mop to mansion, Elijah's story is the real American dream, stolen. This is what systemic racism looks like. Malik's office was flooded with calls, offers for interviews, legal consultants, activists, donations. One email from a Harvard law professor simply read, "If you need an amicus brief filed, I'm in." Elijah didn't check social media. He didn't have to. Strangers began showing up at the Crawford estate gates with signs, "Justice for Elijah. This house was stolen. Dignity can't be mopped away." Inside the mansion, chaos erupted. Judith threw her phone across the marble floor. "They're pulling funding. Our garden gala canceled. The charity board resigned." Bradley paced furiously. "Do something, Dad. Tell them it's fake. Tell them he forged the documents." Preston stood at the window, watching the small crowd gathering outside the gates. For the first time in decades, he looked uncertain, rattled. "Everything's in place, right?" he asked Bradley. "The trusts, the shell companies, they can't touch our assets." Bradley didn't respond. He was staring at his own phone, watching as his face, blurred but recognizable, appeared in repost after repost. One comment below the video read, "Bradley Crawford is the face of generational entitlement." The fallout reached beyond their gates. Real estate partners began backing out of Crawford properties. A major PR firm dropped the Crawfords as clients. Judith's name was removed from a local museum board. Country club friends stopped replying to texts. It was a quiet collapse, not with fire, but with frost. Power, once assumed permanent, had begun to shrink in the face of public truth. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in a small folding chair outside Malik's office, quietly stunned by the storm he had triggered. He hadn't asked for this attention. He didn't want fame. What he wanted was justice, a name restored, a promise honored. But now, the world was demanding that too. Sophia's interview clips ran nightly. She asked him gently, "What does it feel like, knowing this house was yours all along?" Elijah's eyes had watered then, like someone took your father's hands and erased them. In another clip he said, "They saw me as background noise, but I come from a line of builders. We don't vanish." A third went viral for its bluntness. "My grandfather planted okra in that soil. They paved it, but the roots never died." The emotional resonance hit hard. School teachers began sharing his story in classrooms. A viral post read, "Show this to anyone who thinks slavery ended in 1865. But not everyone celebrated. An anonymous letter arrived at Elijah's home, no return address. Inside, a printout of the deed, scrawled over in red ink with the words, "Liar." Tucked beneath it was a photo of Elijah outside the Crawford estate, circled in black marker. Malik had it analyzed. "They're trying to intimidate you." Elijah only said, "They've been trying for 100 years. Despite the threats, he stood firm. When invited to speak at a community forum, he went. When asked to address a local college's civil justice panel, he stood behind the podium with shaking hands and a steady voice. "Don't let your silence become someone else's inheritance," he told the crowd. "Speak before they write your story for you." Meanwhile, Preston Crawford's legal team scrambled behind the scenes. They filed a motion to suppress the deed's relevancy, claimed Elijah's documents were incomplete, claimed the city's storage policies were flawed, claimed that Elijah was manipulating history. But truth, once released, is hard to cage. Then the city clerk's office, under mounting pressure from the media, conducted an internal audit. And what they found was damning. A backdated entry in the 1970 tax record. A removed microfilm reel. A handwritten margin note from Councilwoman Delia Rowe. Transfer expedited. Keep quiet. The city scheduled an emergency hearing. The ruling would determine whether the case could proceed to full trial and whether a stay order could be placed on the Crawford estate. A public announcement was made. The media would be allowed inside. Malik broke the news to Elijah that afternoon. They've set the date, 3 days. Judge Alston is presiding. Elijah sat still, the weight of everything falling on his shoulders again. I'm not ready, he whispered. Malik leaned forward. You've been ready your whole life. They took your land. They stole your voice. Now they're scared you found it again. Elijah nodded slowly. He stood, breathing deeply, and walked out of the office. On the sidewalk outside, a teenager held up a phone and shouted, Mr. Harris, can I get a selfie? You're a hero. Elijah offered a tired smile. I'm just a man who remembers. That evening, as Elijah returned home, a black SUV idled at the curb. A man in a gray suit stepped out, blocking his path. Mr. Harris, I work for the mayor's office. She'd like to speak with you privately. They gave him their dirt. He gave them dignity in return. The days after the ruling moved slowly, like time itself was unsure how to proceed without its usual patterns. Reporters thinned out. Protesters packed up. Headlines shifted. But inside the mansion, Elijah's mansion, change echoed in the walls with every footstep he took. The past had been corrected in ink and law, but dignity wasn't something a judge could decree. It had to be chosen. Elijah stood in the front yard on the 30th day, watching a moving truck idle at the gate. The Crawfords were packing up. Judith hadn't returned since the court date. Preston hadn't spoken a word to Elijah. Only Bradley had lingered, stalking the house like a caged lion, his movements erratic, his eyes heavy with resentment. Inside, movers walked carefully around Elijah, avoiding eye contact as they removed furniture. Framed awards, family photos, items purchased with the wealth built on soil his grandfather once tilled. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, to gloat, to humiliate. But Elijah didn't. Because the deeper he breathed in the silence of reclaimed space, the more he understood something his grandfather had always said. Dignity don't come from how you're treated. It comes from how you carry the weight they hand you. That afternoon, he found Mrs. Crawford, Judith's mother, sitting alone on a bench by the garden. Her hands were folded, her gaze fixed on a blooming camellia bush she once insisted Elijah prune just a little softer. He approached quietly. She spoke first. He built this garden for her, you know, she said. Preston's father. The white roses were her favorite, but that camellia, your grandfather planted that. I remember him explaining how deep the roots had to go for it to bloom right. Elijah nodded, standing a few feet away. I'm sorry, she said, her voice shaking. I remember your grandfather's hands, and your father's eyes. I always wondered why they stopped coming around. Because they were forced out, Elijah said gently. Because kindness doesn't cancel silence. She bowed her head. Judith won't say it. And Preston, he's too proud. But what was done to your family was wrong. A long pause. I didn't ask for this house, Elijah said. But now that it's mine, I'm going to make it mean something. She looked up, tears brimming. You already have. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the front lawn, Elijah stepped inside one last time before the Crawfords' final departure. He found Bradley in the study, his back to the door, staring at an empty bookshelf. You came to gloat? Bradley asked, not turning. No. Bradley turned slowly, eyes burning. You think you're better than us now? No, Elijah replied. But I know what it cost to survive people like you. Bradley scoffed. My whole life, I thought we were the good guys. Because no one ever told you otherwise. A long pause stretched between them. You could press charges, Bradley said, for the threats, the records they tried to destroy. I know. But you won't. Elijah shook his head. Justice doesn't need to humiliate. It just needs to stand. Bradley exhaled, his pride collapsing silently behind his eyes. You're not the man I thought you were. That's the difference between you and me, Elijah replied, voice steady. I saw you clearly from day one. Bradley walked out. Elijah stood alone in the study, the shelves empty, the past finally exhaled. Later that week, Malik returned to discuss the city's offer. They sat on the porch, Elijah in a chair that once wasn't his to sit in, Malik thumbing through paperwork. They want to turn this into a legacy site, Malik said. Civil rights heritage designation, cultural funding, tours, programs. Elijah listened, nodding. But only if you're willing. Elijah looked out across the lawn. The trees swayed gently. The sky was calm. Let's do it. Malik smiled. You sure? I'm not just taking the house back, Elijah said. I'm giving it a future. 2 days later, a crew arrived with wooden stakes, ropes, and signage. Elijah directed them himself. They worked into the evening, under his guidance. That night, the mansion looked different, not because it was cleaner or grander, but because it was his vision now. On the front lawn, staked firmly into the ground, stood a new sign. Public Cultural Center opening soon. A place for history, healing, and hope. As Elijah stepped back to admire the sign, his phone buzzed, a private number. He answered. A voice said, "You've inspired a lot of people, Mr. Harris, but not all of them want to see you win. You should check your back fence." When the gavel falls, centuries of silence begin to shatter. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Alston returned from chambers, a thick folder tucked beneath her arm. Elijah's heart beat so loudly he could barely hear the bailiff call the court back into session. Malik sat beside him, calm but coiled, a fighter waiting for the final bell. Across the aisle, Preston Crawford sat rigid, Bradley next to him, pale and twitching his leg. Judith was notably absent. Judge Alston adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. This matter has been reviewed extensively. The documents presented, including the unbroken deed, the original will, and the city's acknowledgement of clerical misconduct, establish legal standing for the petitioner. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Elijah didn't blink. The Harris family's rights to Parcel 443 were, in this court's finding, not only violated through improper foreclosure and forged documentation, but suppressed through coordinated negligence and corruption by former public officials. She looked directly at Preston. This court finds that the property known as the Crawford estate rightfully belongs to Mr. Elijah M. Harris II, as legal heir of Elijah M. Harris Sr. The words hit like thunder. A stunned silence followed, then chaos. Reporters scrambled for cameras. Phones lit up. Someone in the back gasped audibly. Bradley's face contorted in disbelief. Preston leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. "You're giving him the house?" he asked, barely concealing his contempt. "I am restoring what should never have been taken," the judge replied. "You and your family have 30 days to vacate the premises. Any damage or removal of property not explicitly purchased or installed by your family will be subject to restitution." Preston stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "This is insane. We've lived there for 40 years. Judge Alston's voice dropped but gained weight. "Then consider this justice. Long delayed, finally delivered." Elijah didn't rise, not immediately. He sat there, the noise of the room swirling around him, a ringing in his ears that sounded like his grandfather's voice whispering, "They can't bury the truth if you stand on it." Outside, a wall of reporters waited. "Elijah, how does it feel? Do you plan to sell the estate? What would your grandfather say? Do you forgive them?" He didn't answer. He walked slowly, Malik at his side, down the courthouse steps, through a sea of flashing bulbs and flying microphones. The air felt heavier, thicker, not with fear, but with history rising up to breathe. That evening, Elijah returned to the mansion. For the first time, he used the front door. No longer with gloves on or a mop bucket at his feet, but with a key in hand and a name that now echoed down the hallways. The house was quiet. The Crawfords were gone for the night, no longer its owners, just tenants on borrowed time. Elijah walked room to room in silence. The chandelier in the foyer, the staircase he once wiped step by step, the kitchen he once cleaned while they laughed upstairs. He ran his hand along the dining room table, the walls, the fireplace mantel. He stopped in what used to be the library, where Preston's trophies lined the shelves. He picked one up, a bronze eagle on a fake marble base, and stared at his own reflection in it. There were no tears. Only weight. He went upstairs, entered the master bedroom, now his, and opened the window. The city lights glimmered like 1,000 stories waiting to be told. Below, someone had placed a single candle on the front steps. No note, just light. Back downstairs, he sat at the base of the staircase and looked around the space that had once made him feel so small. It didn't anymore. It felt unfinished. He rose and entered the den, sat at the large oak desk, Preston's desk, and opened the center drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of envelopes, was something unexpected. A photograph. It was old, black and white, faded at the edges. 3 men stood in front of a farmhouse. One was Preston's father. The other, unmistakable, was Elijah's grandfather. They were shaking hands. Behind them, a third man held a document. A lawyer, maybe, or a broker. On the back of the photo, scribbled in pencil, "Final transfer. Crawford takes deed. No mention of clause." Elijah turned it over, eyes narrowing. No mention of clause. He slid the photo into a folder. Then the doorbell rang. He opened it to find a city courier, young, nervous, carrying an official envelope. Elijah Harris, the courier asked.
Yes.
You've been summoned by the mayor's office. Personal request. It's time sensitive. Elijah took the envelope and closed the door. Inside was a formal letter, stamped with the city seal and handwritten in blue ink at the bottom. Mr. Harris, in light of recent events, we'd like to speak with you about repurposing the Crawford estate for a public legacy project. Please contact the Office of Equity and Heritage. Mayor L. Perkins. Elijah stared at the letter, then back at the glowing mansion behind him. For the first time, it wasn't just his house. It might be his history's rebirth. The courtroom isn't where justice lives. It's where pain fights for breath. The courtroom was stark, wooden pews worn from time, walls bare except for the Georgia seal hanging behind the judge's bench, like a reminder of a system that had failed many before Elijah. The room was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt like a battleground where every word spoken had the weight of history behind it. Elijah sat at the petitioner's table next to Malik, dressed in his best, a pressed navy suit borrowed from his cousin, and polished shoes that had seen more church funerals than courtrooms. His fingers clutched a folder holding copies of the deed, the will, and a handwritten note from his grandfather. He didn't look at the Crawfords across the aisle, but he could feel them, like cold drafts off marble. Judge Alston entered, an older black woman, with salt and pepper hair, deliberate movements, and eyes that seemed to see through everyone. We are here to determine the validity of a motion to halt further legal transactions involving Parcel 4413, also known as the Crawford estate, she announced. This is not a ruling on final ownership, but on the standing of the petitioner and the potential merit of his claims. Malik stood. Your Honor, we present documentation showing unbroken ownership by the Harris family dating back to 1948, including a deed never legally voided and a will passed down to Mr. Elijah Harris. We also present evidence of forged tax foreclosure, city council misconduct, and corroborating testimony from a former county clerk who witnessed the fraudulent transfer. Judge Alston nodded once. Proceed. The first witness was Sam Whitmore. He shuffled to the stand slowly, a cane in one hand and a trembling resolve in the other. He swore in and began to speak. I watched them take the land, he said, voice cracking. Elijah's grandfather paid every cent. I stamped the receipt. The foreclosure happened anyway. I was too scared to speak then, but I kept the papers. The courtroom held its breath. Malik walked him through the timeline. The judge scribbled notes. When Preston's lawyer tried to discredit him by asking about his mental health, Sam sat taller. My memory's fine. It's my shame that kept me silent, not confusion. Next, Malik called Dr. Ramona Ellis, a professor of African American studies. This is a textbook case of heir property theft, she testified. From 1910 to 1997, over 8 million acres of black-owned land were lost, often through mechanisms like this: quiet title actions, tax miscommunication, and backdoor policy. She looked directly at the Crawfords. In some cases, like this one, it wasn't ignorance, it was design. Elijah's breath caught. He had never heard his family's pain laid out so clinically, so publicly, yet so truthfully. Then came his turn. He took the stand, hand raised, voice shaking, but sure. I used to mow the lawn in front of a house built on my grandfather's dream, he began. I cleaned floors, walked by people who never once wondered where the wood came from. I was invisible until I wasn't. He held up the will. He left this for me, not just the paper, the principle. And I've carried it, quietly, through every insult, every time I was told to use the back entrance, every time someone called me boy with a smile. Malik asked him gently, why now? Because I got tired of surviving someone else's lie. Silence. Even the Crawford's lawyer stopped writing. Preston shifted in his seat, stone-faced. Bradley avoided eye contact. Judith crossed her arms tightly. Then it was their turn. Their attorney called Bradley first. We've lived there for decades, Bradley said stiffly. My father bought that land fair and square. This guy shows up with old documents, and suddenly we're thieves? Malik stood. Do you know where your father got the down payment? Bradley blinked. He worked. He invested. Are you aware of the 1970 zoning meeting notes, signed by Councilwoman Delia Rowe, that approved the redevelopment of stolen land? No. Do you know that the same year, a motion was filed to erase the tax protest filed by Elijah's father?
I don't.
Malik pressed forward. Do you know what it's like to watch someone clean your house, knowing they built it with their own name and you erased it? Objection, the defense snapped. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. But her eyes lingered on Bradley. long enough for him to shift uncomfortably in his seat. Next came Preston. He was measured, controlled. My father was a businessman. We followed the law. Malik stepped in. The law isn't always just, Mr. Crawford. Isn't it true your father received a campaign donation from Councilwoman Rowe 2 weeks after the land auction? Preston's jaw clenched. I have no knowledge of that. Malik handed the judge a copy of the donation receipt. Is this your father's signature? Preston didn't respond. The judge finally spoke, her voice low. Mr. Crawford, are you telling this court your family was unaware this land once belonged to the Harris family? Preston hesitated. Then it was a different time. She leaned forward. So you're telling me this land was stolen, and you simply inherited the theft? Preston didn't speak again. The courtroom stilled. The judge leaned back, removed her glasses, and sighed. This court needs time to review these documents, she said. Due to the nature of the claims, I'm calling a recess for a private chambers session. Counsel for both parties will be present. I will reconvene this hearing at 2 p.m. She rose. The bailiff called for a recess. Elijah stood slowly, sweat dampening his collar, knees stiff. Malik squeezed his shoulder. You did it. But Elijah shook his head, eyes distant. We're not done yet. As Elijah stepped outside the courtroom for air, his phone buzzed, an unknown number. He answered. A voice whispered, they're going to bury the city records tonight. Get there first, or it's all gone. The past didn't just live in Elijah's bones. It bled through the mansion's bricks. The message had rattled him. Check your back fence. Elijah had gone out with a flashlight that same night. He scanned the perimeter carefully, eyes sharp, breath shallow. At first, nothing. Then, tucked low beneath the vine-covered edge of the fence, he found it. A scorched patch of earth, small but deliberate. Burned into the soil was a symbol, a crude blackened X made of scorched wood. And beside it, a single word carved into the base of the fence. Thief. Elijah stared at it for a long time, the light from the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Not out of fear, but exhaustion. It was a reminder that even when you win, some people only see you as a threat, not because of what you've taken, but because of what you've reclaimed. He didn't call the police. He called Malik. They'll try to scare you, Malik said, but what you're doing now, it's already bigger than them. And it was. By the end of the month, renovations began, but they weren't to restore opulence. They were to tell the truth. The third floor was converted into gallery space. The dining hall became a community classroom. Elijah brought in Black historians, architects, and cultural consultants from across Georgia. Together, they peeled back wallpaper and discovered original brickwork. They uncovered a hidden storage room beneath the kitchen, containing old blueprints, scribbled floor plans, and faded ledger books from the 1940s. One signed E.M. Harris. He stood in that room for over an hour, fingers brushing over the handwritten notes his grandfather had once left. The ink may have faded, but the voice behind it felt newly alive. Word spread quickly. Donations poured in. Local artists painted murals of Black landowners, scientists, musicians. Schoolchildren began to visit, walking through halls that had once silenced stories like theirs, now hearing tales of resistance, survival, and rebuilding. One little boy stood in front of a wall of family trees and whispered to his teacher, "He looks like me." A documentary crew reached out. A national streaming platform had picked up Elijah's story. They wanted to film everything, from the courtroom sketches, to community interviews, to Elijah walking through the very halls he once mopped. I don't want to be famous, Elijah told the director. The director nodded. You already are, but we're not here for fame. We're here for history. In the garden, the camellias bloomed again, richer somehow than years past. Elijah often sat near the bench where Mrs. Crawford had once apologized. She never returned after that day. But she sent a letter, handwritten and tear-stained, thanking him for choosing humanity over hatred. It now sat in a display case near the library, labeled Dignity Returned. The walls of the mansion were no longer silent. They held music now, laughter. The steady footfalls of curious minds learning that justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears old boots, carries a mop, and speaks softly until someone finally listens. One afternoon, Elijah stood at the top of the stairs, watching a group of children tour the home. A little girl looked up at him and asked, "Did you build this place?" He smiled. "My family did." She nodded, then skipped away, notebook in hand, sketching something with focus. In the evening, as the last visitor left, a volunteer handed Elijah a small box that had arrived earlier that day with no return address. It was wrapped in twine, the edges yellowed, and the top bore a name that knocked the air from Elijah's chest. For Elijah, from Granddad. Malik, who had just stepped into the foyer, saw the color drain from Elijah's face. You all right? Elijah nodded slowly. This, this was his handwriting. He took the box into the former study, now a reading room, and sat at the large oak desk. His hands trembled as he untied the twine and lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of letters, bound by a ribbon. Beneath them a pocket watch, rusted but ticking, and at the bottom a folded piece of paper that simply read, "You were always meant to come back. This land was never just soil. It was a promise. Keep it." Elijah unfolded the first letter, eyes filling. As he turned the final page of the first letter, something fell out, a hand-drawn map marked with a red X deep in the property's woods, and the note, "Where the truth is buried." Sometimes the loudest voice comes from those who were never heard. Elijah sat still for a long time, staring at the map and the red X scrawled across a section of the woods behind the mansion. But before he moved, before curiosity could pull him out the door, he picked up the first letter from the box, the one marked with the simple phrase, "Start here." The envelope was hand-addressed in black ink, faded at the corners. Inside was a letter written in a tight, slanted script, his grandfather's. "Elijah, if you are reading this, it means something I prayed for has happened. Either justice has found you, or you've come searching for it yourself. Either way, I'm proud. I bought this land in 1948 with hands blistered from working somebody else's cotton. Your grandmother didn't believe it at first, said they don't let men like us own places like that, but we did. We built it up from the roots, dug the well ourselves, laid the stone steps with your father when he was only 10. Elijah felt his throat tighten as he read. The words weren't just history, they were blood, sweat and memory poured onto paper. They came for it slow, not with chains, but with pens, not with whips, but with policies. They said I missed a tax deadline. I didn't. I had the receipt. They said I didn't notify the county. I did. They said I never really owned it. But I did. I still do. I watched men. I shook hands with vote to tear our home down. And I kept my voice steady, because yelling makes you easy to silence. I wanted to fight louder, but your father begged me to stay calm. For him, for you, for the future. The letter went on, describing how Elijah Sr. had buried not just the legal deed, but all the original documents deep in a chest wrapped in tar and canvas, near a spot behind the barn that no longer stood. There's more buried out there than truth. There's pride, and the story of how we were made to believe we were only tenants of our own lives. If they've told you that you're lucky to be allowed in, remind them you were born to own. Elijah's hands trembled as he continued. They can steal a house, boy, but don't you ever let them own your soul. By the time he reached the final line, Elijah's cheeks were streaked with silent tears. I hope this letter finds you standing tall, and if it doesn't, I hope it helps you rise. He folded the letter slowly, fingers brushing the creases like sacred fabric. For a few moments he just breathed. He let the pain wash over him like rain hitting parched soil. But what rose inside him wasn't despair, it was fire. That night, guided by the map, Elijah walked alone into the woods, a lantern in hand, the hum of cicadas around him. He followed the trail through the underbrush behind the mansion, past where the old barn used to stand. The moonlight filtered through the trees, silvering the leaves, casting long shadows. At the spot marked by the red X, he stopped. The ground looked undisturbed, just pine needles and damp earth. But he dug anyway, not with tools, with his hands. 30 minutes in, his fingers struck something hard.
What?
He cleared the dirt away carefully, revealing the corner of a weathered crate. It took all his strength to pull it loose. The metal hinges were rusted shut. He pried them open with a rock, breath shallow, chest tight. Inside, a tarred canvas wrap, inside of which lay 3 carefully preserved items. A thick journal bound in leather, titled Land and Lineage. A sealed envelope marked to be opened when they finally listen. And one final folded document. Elijah lifted the last document from the crate, brushing away flakes of dust. The paper was stiff, thick, almost parchment-like, and across the top, in bold, hand-lettered ink, Land Reclamation Agreement, private notarized, 19... He turned it over, and his heart stopped. It bore the signature of Henry Crawford, Preston's father, agreeing to return the land to Elijah Harris Sr. upon repayment of a promissory note. Stamped, dated, notarized. Never honored. Never mentioned. Never filed. Elijah stared at the signature, the Crawford seal next to it, and knew instantly, this was the final proof. Not just of ownership, but of the Crawfords' original guilt and willful cover-up. As Elijah held the document, his phone buzzed with a message from Malik. Emergency. The Crawfords just filed a countersuit. They're claiming you forged the entire claim. We need to talk now. Elijah never needed to shout. His story roared without a single scream. Elijah stood before the mansion, his mansion, as the sun filtered through the trees, casting soft gold across the stone pathway. The once imposing columns no longer loomed. They stood in welcome. Where silence had once served as his shield, now it served as his banner. Not a quiet surrender, but a dignified presence. A presence that demanded nothing, yet commanded everything. Behind him, the front doors of the Crawford estate, no, Elijah Hall, swung open. Inside, voices hummed. The scent of freshly sanded wood and aged paper lingered in the air. The gallery was ready. The museum room had been labeled and curated. In the study-turned-library, copies of land records, oral histories, and photographs filled the shelves. Children were the first to enter. One boy paused on the steps, staring up at Elijah. "You really lived here?" he asked, wide-eyed. Elijah smiled softly. "I do now." Families poured in, weaving through the exhibits. Local elders stopped before a portrait of Elijah's grandfather, reading his words etched in bronze. "They can take the house, but not the roots." In another room, a screen played clips from the documentary, Elijah scrubbing that porch. Then later, Elijah holding the deed. Then walking the courthouse steps. Then standing before the very judge who helped untie history's knot. Outside, across the lawn, cameras had gathered again. But this time not to chase scandal. They came to witness something rare. A victory that had neither violence nor vengeance. But the undeniable power of truth returned. Meanwhile, a black SUV pulled out of the estate's driveway for the final time. Bradley sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes down. Judith wept quietly behind her sunglasses. Preston drove, his jaw set, his eyes locked straight ahead. They passed the protest banners still fluttering outside the gates, and for the first time in their lives, they didn't wave them off as noise. They saw them. Each sign a mirror. Each chant a ledger. Each silence a receipt finally due. Back at Elijah Hall, Malik approached with the final ruling from the city clerk's office. The buried agreement, the one from Henry Crawford, Elijah's grandfather's gentleman's deal, had been authenticated. It wasn't just admissible in court, it was irreversible. "Their countersuit's dead," Malik said, offering the paper. "You win, again." Elijah took the document, folded it gently, and slipped it into his breast pocket. He didn't smile. He nodded. That night, under string lights draped across the garden, the opening celebration began. Black musicians played jazz by the fountain. Elders told stories around fire pits. College students took photos for their history projects. And in the corner of the gallery, a new piece had been unveiled. A sculpture carved from oak and iron, shaped like a tree with one strong root breaking through concrete. At the base, a single word: return. Elijah stood under the tree hours later, watching the last guests depart. The lights dimmed, the house behind him buzzed with life, a new kind of energy, purpose, belonging. He walked the halls once more that evening, touched the walls, listened to them. And the silence? It was different now. It didn't choke. It breathed. He entered the main foyer and stared up at the vaulted ceiling. The chandelier gleamed softly, and in that moment, every version of him, young Elijah, quiet janitor Elijah, grieving son Elijah, stood there with him. He closed his eyes. "Granddad," he whispered, "they see us now." Outside, a small crowd remained. Teachers, parents, elders. They stood together as workers prepared to unveil the final touch, a bronze nameplate fixed above the archway. A hush fell. The cloth was pulled away. And there it was. Elijah Hall. A home returned, a legacy revived. The camera zoomed out slowly, rising above the mansion, catching the flicker of lights inside, and the stillness of justice outside. As the view expanded skyward, one final image came into focus. A new garden taking root where the fence had once been scorched, and at its center, a sapling wrapped in ribbon, planted by a group of children who now knew his name. Stories like Elijah's aren't just about the past, they're reminders of what still needs to be reclaimed today. If this story moved you, if it made you think deeper about justice, dignity, and legacy, then help us keep these voices alive. Like this video to push these untold truths into more feeds. Share it with someone who needs to see it. And subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that don't just entertain, they awaken. Because silence doesn't change the world. Stories do.